The Tiger Eye, the name alone sent shivers through Allied tank crews. To the soldiers on the ground, it wasn't just another armored vehicle. It was a monster of steel, precision, and fear. When the ground shook and that low, rumbling engine echoed across the hills of Europe, you knew something terrifying was coming your way. But no amount of stories could prepare the Americans for what they'd discovered when they finally captured one. Beneath its fearsome reputation, beneath its thick armor and thundering gun, lay a secret that shattered the myth of German engineering perfection. The Tiger, the so-called king of tanks, could barely make it 120 miles on a full tank of fuel. The Tiger Eye rolled into the war in 1942, designed to dominate every battlefield it touched. With armor up to 120 millimeters thick and an 80 mm KWK-36 L-56 gun, that could destroy a Sherman before the Americans even saw where it was coming from. It quickly earned the nickname Beast of Europe. On the Eastern Front, Soviet tankers whispered about it like a ghost story. One Tiger could halt an entire advance. To the German army, it was more than a tank. It was propaganda made of metal, proof of supposed German superiority in engineering and warfare. But myths are easy to build from a distance. The truth, that's something you only discover up close. In early 1943, in the deserts of Tunisia, American forces clashed with the German Africa Corps. The Americans were new to tank warfare compared to their battle-hardened German opponents. Their M4 Shermans were reliable and easy to repair, but against the Tigers, they felt like toys. Reports came in from across the front lines. "Our shells bounce right off it," one gunner complained after watching his 75mm rounds spark harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. The legend was spreading fast. Soldiers told stories of a single Tiger holding off entire companies. Commanders whispered in frustration about how to stop them. The Tiger became a shadow, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. But while Allied soldiers feared it, German crews knew a different side of the story, a side they didn't want to talk about. For every Tiger that roared into battle, there was another sitting broken down somewhere in a field. The tank's complex suspension system, its intricate gearbox, and its heavy weight made it a nightmare to maintain. It wasn't unusual for a Tiger to be left behind, not because of enemy fire, but because of something as simple as an oil leak or a broken final drive. And that's exactly what happened in Tunisia. As American forces pushed through German positions, a small group of U.S. soldiers stumbled upon a Tiger sitting eerily silent. Its paint was scorched, its tracks half buried in the sand. The German crew had abandoned it after mechanical failure made it impossible to move. But the Americans didn't realize what they'd found, not at first. They approached it cautiously, rifles ready. The sheer size of the machine stunned them. Towering nearly 10 feet tall, over 12 feet wide, it looked less like a tank and more like a battleship stranded on land. The soldiers climbed onto it, running their hands across the thick metal, knocking on the armor plates, amazed that something this massive could exist. When word spread that the Americans had captured a Tiger intact, engineers and officers rushed to the scene. They wanted to know everything. What kind of armor was it made of? What kind of gun did it use? How thick were the plates? Every bolt and weld held a secret that could help the Allies understand how to defeat it. But the real surprise came when they tried to get it running. After a few adjustments and some fresh fuel, the Maybach HL-230 engine coughed to life. It was a deep, growling sound that sent vibrations through the sand. The Americans were impressed until they watched the fuel gauge. Within minutes, it started to drop, fast. The engine's roar was mesmerizing, but it came at a cost. They decided to test how far it could actually go. They drove it a few miles across the desert, turning, climbing slight hills, trying to simulate real combat conditions. By the time they brought it back, the fuel gauge was nearly empty. Shocked, they calculated the fuel consumption and realized that even with its massive Femmer 40-liter tank, the Tiger could only travel around 120 miles on ideal ground. That meant in the mud of Europe or the snow of the Eastern Front, its range would drop even lower, sometimes to less than 60 miles per tank. The Americans couldn't believe it. The Germans had built a tank so advanced, so heavily armored, so powerful, yet it could barely stay operational long enough to reach the front lines. When the captured Tiger was shipped back to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, U.S. engineers began an exhaustive teardown. They wanted to understand every nut and bolt of this mechanical monster. What they found was both brilliant and baffling. The Tiger's construction was incredibly detailed. Everything was machined to perfection. Its armor was made of high-quality rolled steel. The optics were unmatched, giving its gunners crystal-clear vision and deadly accuracy. The suspension system was smooth, allowing the tank to cross uneven ground with surprising stability. On the surface, it was the perfect tank. But the closer they looked, the more problems they found. Its gearbox was so complex that it required specialized tools and training to repair, things the average German mechanic in the field simply didn't have. Its engine, though powerful, strained constantly under the tank's immense 57-ton weight. Even its overlapping road wheels, designed for smoother travel, became traps for mud and ice that froze solid in cold conditions, locking the tracks entirely. Every element of the Tiger screamed excellence and inefficiency. In battle, it took nearly an hour to refuel, and with fuel shortages crippling Germany's war effort, that meant Tigers that often sat idle while lighter tanks and trucks were prioritized. Its fuel consumption was so bad that commanders had to carefully plan its movements, calculating every mile like gold. A single long maneuver could empty its tanks before it even saw combat. And when it broke down, which it often did, recovering it was almost impossible. Too heavy to tow with standard vehicles. Most disabled Tigers were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. That's why when the Americans found one intact, it was such an extraordinary event. Still, the Tiger's psychological power was undeniable. Even if it didn't reach the battlefield often, its mere presence terrified Allied troops. Pilots reported entire columns halting when someone thought they saw a Tiger silhouette on the horizon. Soldiers exaggerated its numbers, convinced that every German tank was a Tiger. The truth was, fewer than 1,350 Tiger I tanks were ever built during the entire war. To put that in perspective, the U.S. produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Yet somehow, the Tiger's legend grew far larger than its actual presence. It was proof that fear, when combined with superior firepower, could be a weapon all its own. Back at Aberdeen, American engineers continued their analysis. They admired the craftsmanship, but shook their heads at the overcomplication. Every component was made with precision, but at the cost of practicality. It was like building a watch to fight a hammer. The Tiger wasn't designed for mass production. It was designed for perfection. And in total war, perfection is a luxury no one can afford. The engineers began comparing the Tiger to their own Sherman tanks. The Sherman was smaller, lighter, and far less intimidating, but it could be repaired in the field with basic tools. It could travel over twice the distance on the same amount of fuel. It could be produced quickly and cheaply, allowing the Allies to replace losses easily. One Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans, but the 6th would destroy the Tiger. That's how wars are won, not through invincible machines, but through endurance, reliability, and the ability to keep moving when the enemy cannot. The Tiger's downfall was written into its design. It was too heavy to maneuver, too complex to maintain, and too thirsty for a nation running out of fuel. The same meticulous German engineering that made it so formidable also made it fragile. And as the Americans studied the captured Tiger, they began to see the larger truth. Germany had built a weapon for a perfect world. But war is anything but perfect. The Tiger might have ruled in theory, but on the real battlefields of Europe and North Africa, where mud-clogged gears, fuel convoys were bombed, and parts were impossible to find, that perfection became its own undoing. By the time Allied troops prepared for the invasion of Normandy, they no longer saw the Tiger as a mythic invincible machine. They saw it as a flawed masterpiece. Dangerous, yes, but vulnerable. They learned how to counter it, how to flank it, how to call in air support before it could line up a shot. And the more they understood it, the less they feared it. But what they didn't know yet was that the Tiger's story, its true story, went far deeper than one tank, one battle, or even one war. It was a symbol of the very philosophy that defined the German war effort, the pursuit of technical perfection at any cost, even when that cost was victory itself. And when the Americans rolled these captured Tiger into the testing grounds for further analysis, they had no idea they were about to uncover something even more shocking. Details about its design and construction that revealed not just the flaws of the tank, but the fatal flaws of the empire that built it. The captured Tiger arrived at the Aberdeen proving ground in Maryland under heavy guard. Soldiers watched in awe as the massive machine rolled off the transport platform, its armor glinting beneath the gray American sky. For months, stories about this terrifying German tank had swept through Allied ranks. Now, engineers and officers could finally see it up close, not as an invincible enemy, but as a machine of steel and bolts, something they could study, measure, and understand. The American ordnance experts approached it with fascination. The first thing they noticed was the craftsmanship. Everything about the Tiger looked deliberate. The welds were clean, the armor was perfectly aligned, the turret's motion smooth and steady. This wasn't the rough, utilitarian design they were used to seeing on their own tanks. It was refined. It looked like something built in a laboratory, not a battlefield. But that precision came at a price. When the engineers started disassembling the Tiger, they realized what kind of monster they were dealing with. Its parts were heavy, oversized, and tightly fitted together. The transmission alone weighed nearly a ton. Every component required multiple men and specialized equipment to remove. This wasn't a vehicle designed for quick fixes or battlefield repair. It was a tank that demanded ideal conditions. And in war, ideal conditions don't exist. As they took it apart, one engineer reportedly said, "This tank wasn't built to fight a war. It was built to impress an engineer." The team began running tests to understand its performance. The Maybach HL230 engine, capable of around 700 horsepower, was powerful by any standard of the time. But the Tiger weighed over 57 tons, and that weight pushed the engine to its limits. When the Americans tried to push the tank at higher speeds, it overheated. The engine coughed, the transmission howled, and the whole machine rattled as if it was struggling to carry its own armor. On paper, the Tiger could reach speeds up to 38 kilometers per hour. In reality, it rarely managed more than 20 on rough terrain. The weight slowed it down so much that even medium tanks like the Sherman could outmaneuver it easily. That was the first major revelation. The Tiger wasn't a hunter. It was a fortress, powerful in defense, vulnerable in motion. Then came the fuel test. They filled its enormous tank to the brim, about 540 liters of gasoline. The Tiger's engine roared as it began a long-distance test on open ground. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. The sound was deep, guttural, like a beast straining against invisible chains. And then, just a few hours later, the fuel gauge was nearly empty. The result shocked everyone. Under perfect conditions, the Tiger could only cover about 120 miles on a full tank. On uneven terrain, the range dropped by nearly half. The engineers recalculated, tested again, and confirmed it. The legendary Tiger was one of the least fuel-efficient machines of the entire war. It was, in their words, a fuel-eating giant. The implications were huge. Germany was already facing severe fuel shortages by 1943. Allied bombers were targeting oil fields and refineries, cutting off supplies from Romania and elsewhere. The Tiger, with its enormous appetite for fuel, was a luxury the German army simply couldn't afford. Every time one moved, it drained resources that could have powered several smaller tanks or trucks. As the American team continued its evaluation, they couldn't help but admire certain features. The optics were extraordinary. Zeiss made gun sights that offered clarity unmatched by anything the Allies had. The gun stabilization was remarkable for its time, and the 80mm Kork 6 cannon was lethal. Its penetration power at over 1,000 meters was devastating. No Allied tank could match it shot for shot. Yet, for all its brilliance, the Tiger was impractical. The Americans documented how its suspension used interleafed road wheels, overlapping metal discs that distributed weight more evenly. It sounded clever in theory. In practice, mud, snow, and debris jammed between the wheels, freezing them solid in cold weather. Crews had to stop, clean out the packed ice, and sometimes remove entire wheels just to move again. What looked like innovation in the design, often turned into a nightmare on the front line. And then there was the cost. Each Tiger took over 300,000 Reichsmarks to build, 5 times more than a Sherman tank. It required tens of thousands of man-hours to produce. Germany simply couldn't manufacture them fast enough. The Americans realized that the Tiger wasn't built for mass production. It was built for prestige, to showcase German engineering excellence, even when that excellence cost efficiency, mobility, and ultimately victory. Meanwhile, the Allies were producing Shermans by the thousands. A Sherman could be built in a week. A Tiger could take months. When a Sherman broke down, it could be repaired in the field with basic tools. When a Tiger broke down, it had to be left behind. In the fast-paced, ever-changing nature of war, that difference mattered more than any advantage in armor or firepower. The Aberdeen engineers compiled their findings into a detailed report. The conclusion was clear. The Tiger was over-engineered, over-fueled, and under-practical. It wasn't a weapon of war. It was a weapon of intimidation. But the Americans weren't done learning from it. They began applying its lessons to their own tank programs. They studied the sloped armor concepts used on Soviet T-34s and the heavy protection of the Tiger to design future tanks that could balance durability with efficiency. Even as they criticized the Tiger's flaws, they respected what it represented, a pursuit of mechanical perfection that pushed the limits of what was possible. Back in Europe, the Tiger's reputation continued to spread. Soldiers on both sides still feared it. The Allied tank crews called it the Beast, and even when they outnumbered it 10-1, they approached cautiously. For them, it wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of everything the German army stood for: power, precision, and pride. Yet, as the war dragged on, that pride became a burden. The German army began losing not just battles, but the ability to sustain itself. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Maintenance became impossible as supply lines collapsed. Commanders had to decide between sending a Tiger into battle or keeping it hidden to conserve resources. Many chose the latter, and countless Tigers were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. When Allied forces pushed deeper into France after D-Day, they encountered fewer functioning Tigers. Most were wrecks, burned out, abandoned, or half buried in mud. The invincible monster was dying not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion. Still, the myth persisted. Even when broken down, the Tiger commanded respect. American and British crews approached them with a mix of fear and curiosity, climbing onto their massive hulks, taking photos beside them like trophies. They were relics of a different kind of war, one fought not just with weapons, but with ideas about superiority and dominance. As the Aberdeen tests continued, the engineers became increasingly fascinated with the paradox of the Tiger. They saw in it both genius and failure. Its armor, when tested, deflected most Allied rounds with ease. Its gun remained unmatched in range and accuracy. But it was the small things, the overcomplicated design, the fragile gearbox, the endless thirst for fuel, that revealed its fatal weaknesses. One of the American analysts summed it up perfectly. The Tiger was not defeated by our guns. It was defeated by its own ambition. The data gathered from the captured Tiger shaped Allied understanding of German armor for years to come. It taught them that the most powerful weapon isn't always the one with the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It's the one that can fight, move, and survive day after day. The Tiger could terrify, yes, but terror doesn't win wars. Endurance does. As the engineers wrapped up their analysis, they sent the Tiger's remains into storage, its massive steel plates marked and cataloged. Some of its components were later used for training and study, others melted down. What once symbolized unstoppable power now sat quietly under tarps, stripped of myth and glory. Yet, even in silence, the Tiger left a legacy. It inspired generations of military designers and historians. It became a lesson in excess, proof that even the most fearsome machines can fall victim to their own brilliance. For the Americans who had first captured it in the desert, the memory never faded. They remembered the shock of seeing how fast its fuel ran out, how quickly its power turned into vulnerability. They remembered the moment they realized that this monstrous machine, once feared across continents, couldn't even make it 120 miles before gasping for more fuel. And that realization, that even the mightiest weapon can be undone by its own weight, changed the way the Allies thought about war itself. Because the Tiger wasn't just a tank. It was a warning, a reminder that strength without sustainability, power without purpose, and perfection without practicality will always lead to downfall. And as the war drew to its end, that truth would become clearer than ever, not just in the fate of the Tiger, but in the fate of the empire that built it. The war was drawing to its brutal close. By 1945, Germany's mighty war machine was breaking apart, piece by piece. Its factories were bombed, its rail lines shattered, its soldiers exhausted. And the Tiger, that once proud symbol of dominance, was dying along with it. Across Europe, the remaining Tigers sat silent in fields and forests. Some burned out from battle, others simply abandoned where they had run dry of fuel. Their massive frames rusted under rain and snow, their once glorious armor now cold and still. The machine that had once represented the pinnacle of German engineering had become a grave marker for a failed vision, a dream of perfection that couldn't survive the reality of war. Were Allied troops advancing into the heart of Germany, seeing a Tiger was still enough to stop them in their tracks. Even broken, it looked invincible. American soldiers took photographs beside them, climbing onto their turrets, marveling at their sheer size. But they also noticed something else. Most of the Tigers they encountered weren't destroyed by enemy fire. They were wrecked from within, their engines seized, their tracks torn off, their fuel tanks bone dry. The Tiger hadn't been defeated in open battle. It had been defeated by the same problem that haunted every German design: over-engineering, over-complexity, and overconfidence. When the war finally ended, the Allies had captured several Tigers in various states of repair. A few were shipped back to Britain, America, and the Soviet Union for further study. Others were left where they stood, too heavy and too damaged to move. In the years that followed, these captured Tigers became prized relics of a war that changed the world. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the American engineers, who had taken apart the first captured Tiger, began documenting everything they'd learned. The report was thick, detailed, and brutally honest. It praised the craftsmanship, but it also listed every flaw, every inefficiency, every reason why the Tiger was destined to fail in a long war. The conclusion was simple. The Tiger was a marvel of design, but not of practicality. It could win battles, but not wars. In post-war Europe, new generations of engineers studied its remains. They saw in its thick armor and powerful gun the blueprint for future heavy tanks. But they also saw its weaknesses: the fuel consumption, the mechanical fragility, the impossibility of mass production. When the United States developed the M26, Pershing and later the M60 Patton, and when the Soviet Union rolled out its T-54s and T-55s, they carried lessons learned from the Tiger's mistakes. The idea was no longer to build the perfect tank, but the effective tank, one that could move fast, fight hard, and be repaired easily. The Tiger had shown the world what not to do, but its myth refused to die. Through the 1950s and 60s, as films and books began to recount the battles of World War II, the Tiger took on a larger-than-life image. Movies showed it as the ultimate weapon, unstoppable and terrifying. Soldiers' stories from the front added to the legend, how they feared hearing its tracks, how its 88-meter gun could obliterate anything in sight. Even though fewer than 1/400 were ever built, people talked about the Tiger as if it were everywhere. In reality, many Allied soldiers never saw one in person. But fear doesn't need numbers. It only needs belief. Historians would later call this the Tiger effect, the psychological power of a weapon far greater than its actual impact. The Tiger had become a symbol of German pride, and after the war, it became a symbol of technological hubris, proof that brilliance without restraint leads to failure. In the ruins of German factories, unfinished Tiger hulls sat gathering dust. The production lines that once forged these machines of terror were now silent. Engineers who had once labored to perfect every rivet and weld were now prisoners of war, reflecting on what they had built. Some admitted that they had known the truth all along. They knew the Tiger was too heavy, too expensive, too complicated. But they built it anyway, because in Nazi Germany, no one questioned orders. The Tiger was not just a machine. It was a statement, a monument to a regime obsessed with image over efficiency, perfection over practicality. Back at Aberdeen, the captured Tiger was eventually dismantled completely. Some of its parts were used for training. Others were scrapped. Its thick armor was cut, its once mighty gun silenced forever. Yet, even in pieces, it continued to teach. The American military documented every detail, from the composition of its steel to the layout of its transmission. These lessons influenced tank design for decades, shaping doctrines and strategies in the Cold War era. When NATO tanks faced off against Soviet armor in later conflicts and simulations, they did so armed with knowledge born from the study of that single captured Tiger. And in that way, the Tiger's legacy survived, not as a weapon of war, but as a teacher of humility. It showed that power alone cannot win, that complexity can destroy as easily as it creates, and that no machine, no matter how mighty, can escape the limits of reality. Today, only a handful of Tigers remain in the world, in museums across Europe, in Bovington, in Saumur, in Munster. They stand silently behind glass or on polished floors. Their steel faded, their engines long dead. Visitors walk around them in awe, staring up at their immense size, reading plaques that tell only part of their story. Some see them as masterpieces, others see them as relics of arrogance. But to those who know their full history, they are reminders of fear, of innovation, and of the fine line between greatness and failure. The Bovington Tiger in England, the only one still running, is perhaps the most haunting of all. Every few years, mechanics carefully start its engine. The sound that emerges is deep and thunderous, the same growl that once echoed across the fields of Normandy. For a moment, it feels as though the ghost of the war stirs again. And then, just as quickly, the sound fades. The beast goes silent once more. It's poetic. In a way, the tank that once symbolized unstoppable force now confined to a museum, able to move only under perfect care and controlled conditions. Even in peace, the Tiger still demands everything: attention, resources, precision. Nothing about it is easy. Nothing ever was. The Tiger's story is the story of ambition taken too far. It's the story of how human obsession with power can create beauty and destruction in equal measure. When American tankers first captured that Tiger in Tunisia, they couldn't believe what they'd found. They expected invincibility. What they discovered was fragility. They expected endless strength. What they saw was limitation. And in that discovery lay the real victory. Because the Tiger I, for all its armor and firepower, taught the world that no machine, no empire, no dream of perfection can last forever. It burned through fuel. It burned through resources, and finally, it burned through its own myth. What remains today isn't the roar of its engine or the fear it once inspired, but the lesson it left behind, a lesson written not in glory, but in rust. Tiger roared once, now it whispers a warning through time. Strength without wisdom is weakness, and power without purpose destroys itself. And that is the true legacy of the Tiger WWII, beast that ruled the battlefield for a moment, but was conquered by the truth of its own design.